I'm a long-haul truck driver. The roads are not safe. I never imagined my life would take such a turn. Growing up in a small town in Missouri, I was always fascinated by the idea of freedom. My father, a truck driver himself, used to tell me stories of the open road, tales of adventure, and the allure of distant horizons. After he passed away when I was 18, I decided to follow in his footsteps. The solitude and the call of the highway seemed like a fitting escape from a life that had become too familiar, too constraining. My days began before the first light of dawn. I'd wake up in my small, cramped sleeper cab, the smell of diesel and the faint odor of the last truck stop's coffee lingering in the air. After a quick bite and a strong cup of joe, I'd check the rig, tires, oil, load securement before hitting the road. My routes took me across desolate stretches of highway, through towns that seemed forgotten by time, and into the heart of sprawling cities where the glow of neon signs and the hum of life never ceased. The work was grueling. Long hours behind the wheel, navigating through unpredictable weather, and the constant pressure to meet delivery deadlines. My only companions were the hum of the engine, the occasional voice on the CB radio, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. The roads could be beautiful, especially at dawn or dusk when the sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, but they could also be treacherous, slick with rain, shrouded in fog, or blindingly bright under the midday sun. The nights were the hardest. The loneliness became palpable, a weight that pressed down on me as the miles slipped away under my tires. The world outside my windshield would dissolve into darkness, punctuated only by the occasional flash of headlights from oncoming traffic or the distant glow of a farmhouse light. I'd listen to the radio, static-filled country songs, and late-night talk shows to keep my mind occupied, but there was always an underlying tension, a sense that the road held secrets best left undiscovered. The roads themselves had a personality. The interstate highways were vast and monotonous, an endless parade of mile markers and exit signs. The rural backroads, however, held a certain charm and a certain danger. They twisted and turned through dense forests, over rolling hills, and past fields of corn that seemed to go on forever. These roads were often deserted at night, and it was here that I had my first unsettling experience. It was a rainy night on a narrow, winding road in West Virginia. The rain pounded against the windshield, and visibility was near zero. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering. I slowed down, against my better judgment, and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. The man nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, and wore outdated clothes. We drove in silence for a few miles before I tried to make conversation, but he just stared straight ahead, saying nothing. His clothes were soaked, yet the seat beside him remained dry. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the eerie silence. He turned his head slowly to face me, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "Home," he whispered. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. When I glanced over again, he was gone. No door opening, no sound, just gone. I pulled over, heart pounding, and searched the cab, but there was no trace of him. I resumed my journey, but the memory of his empty eyes haunted me for weeks. In Arizona, on a desolate stretch of Route 66, I picked up a woman who flagged me down. She said her car had broken down and asked for a lift to the nearest town. We chatted for a while, and she seemed perfectly normal. But then she started asking strange questions, if I believed in ghosts, if I'd ever seen anything unusual on the road. Her voice took on a distant, almost otherworldly quality as she recounted local legends. Her eyes never seemed to meet mine, and I noticed her hands were ice cold despite the warm night air. "Do you think they ever really leave?" she asked suddenly, her voice a mere whisper. "Who?" I asked, but she only smiled and looked out the window. I glanced away for a second, and when I looked back, she had vanished, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender. The passenger seat was undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. I drove on, my heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that I had encountered something not of this world. I pulled into a rest stop in New Mexico, exhausted from hours of driving. As I stepped out of the truck, I noticed an old man sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. I nodded a greeting, but he didn't respond. After using the restroom, I returned to find the bench empty. Puzzled, I walked over to a trucker parked nearby and mentioned the old man. The trucker's face went pale. "You saw him too?" he asked. "Yeah, he was just sitting here," I replied. "He's been dead for years," the trucker said, voice trembling. "Killed in a robbery right here. People say he shows up sometimes, still waiting for help." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The bench where the old man had sat now seemed to exude a chill, and I hurried back to my truck, eager to put distance between myself and the rest stop. The trucker's words echoed in my mind, and the thought of the old man waiting for help he would never receive haunted my thoughts. Driving through Kentucky one night, I heard a haunting melody coming from the woods alongside the road. It was an old, sorrowful tune played on a fiddle, the kind of music that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. The eerie sound floated through the air, filling the cab with its mournful strains. I slowed down, trying to see where it was coming from, but the darkness revealed nothing. The music continued for miles, growing louder and more insistent. It felt as if it was calling to me, beckoning me to leave the safety of my truck and venture into the woods. As I drove on, the melody began to warp, the notes twisting into a dissonant cacophony that grated on my nerves. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the music stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I sped up, desperate to escape whatever unseen force had been playing that haunting tune. On a deserted highway in Nevada, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A convoy of old military trucks was approaching fast. I moved to the side to let them pass, but they never did. The trucks followed me for several miles, their lights flickering in and out, as if caught in some otherworldly time loop. Nervously, I watched as the convoy grew closer, their engines roaring in the still night air. I could see the drivers now, grim-faced soldiers, their eyes staring straight ahead. They looked like they were trapped in a moment from the past, doomed to repeat their journey forever. The lead truck pulled up beside me, and I caught a glimpse of the driver's face. It was hollow, skeletal, with empty eye sockets that seemed to bore into my soul. Panic started to set in, and I slammed on the gas, trying to outrun the ghostly convoy. After what felt like an eternity, the trucks vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving me shaken and drenched in cold sweat. One night in Mississippi, I stopped at a crossroads to check my map. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of my truck settling. As I was about to pull away, a tall, shadowy figure appeared in front of the truck. Its eyes glowed red, and it pointed down one of the roads. Paralyzed with fear, I couldn't move as the figure slowly approached. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural heat, distorting its form. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. The figure's voice was a guttural rasp. "A lost soul," it said. "Turn back or join me in the shadows." My heart pounded in my chest as I floored the accelerator, speeding away in the opposite direction. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the crossroads, its red eyes glowing brighter. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, waiting for the moment I would return. In the swamps of Louisiana, I heard the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. It was late, and there were no houses or cars around. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and I felt an overwhelming urge to investigate. Against my better judgment, I stopped the truck and stepped out into the humid night air. The sound seemed to come from deeper within the swamp, and I found myself wading through murky water, guided only by the plaintive cries. The further I went, the more the landscape seemed to change, trees twisted into grotesque shapes, and the air grew thick with an unnatural fog. Suddenly, the crying stopped, and I found myself alone in the middle of the swamp. The silence was deafening, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I turned to head back to the truck, but the path seemed to have disappeared. Panic set in as I stumbled through the darkness, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on me. After what felt like hours, I finally found my way back to the truck. As I climbed into the cab, I noticed something wet and slimy clinging to my boot. It was a small, tattered piece of cloth, stained with what looked like old blood. I never stopped in Louisiana again. The last and most terrifying experience happened on a deserted highway in Wyoming. It was a moonless night, and the road was enveloped in darkness. Out of nowhere, a figure on horseback appeared in my headlights, a rider dressed in pale, tattered clothes with an expression of utter sorrow. I swerved to avoid him, but my truck slid off the road and into a ditch. The engine died, and I sat there, heart pounding, as the rider approached. His eyes were hollow, and his skin was ashen, stretched tight over his bones. He reached out a skeletal hand, and I felt an icy grip on my soul. "Why do you wander these roads?" he asked, his voice a ghostly whisper. "I'm just trying to do my job," I stammered, "trying to start the engine." "These roads belong to the dead," he said. "Leave before it's too late." The truck finally roared back to life, and I sped away, but the rider followed, his spectral horse keeping pace with my truck. He reached out again, and I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. Panic surged through me as I pushed the truck to its limits, desperate to escape. In a final desperate move, I swerved sharply, the truck careening off the road and coming to a stop in a field. The rider was gone, but I could still feel his presence, a cold, lingering touch on my soul. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for breath, and saw the figure standing a distance away, watching me with those hollow eyes. I managed to get the truck back on the road and drive to the nearest town, where I spent the night in a cheap motel, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I decided it was time to leave the open road and its ghosts behind forever. I sold my truck and took a job at a local repair shop, content to live a quieter, safer life. The memories of those haunted nights still linger, a constant reminder of the terrors that lurk in the shadows of the highway